Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for this delightfully spicy panel that's about to happen. My name is Laura McCoolidge. I'm the VP of Strategic Investments at Strada Education Foundation, and I have the honor of moderating this amazing panel of leaders to talk about the transformative potential of VR in skill development across sectors. We have a lot of content and thoughts to share from our panelists today, so I think we should just dive right in and share backgrounds along with sentiments on the first question. I think we should start off and get right to the heart of the matter today. So Mark, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off with a little bit about your background in Mursion and an answer on the question of, from your perspective, when is the use of VR transformative in skill development? But also, when is it not?
Well, great. Thank you, Laura. Thanks, all of you, for being here this morning. Mark Atkinson, CEO of Mursion. Mursion does immersive simulations around the sort of human dimensions of skill development, leadership, customer service, training, sales. I would say at the heart of the experience that Mursion creates, it is simulation for behavior change in leaders that have a professional practice that needs to be assessed and developed and can only really be assessed and developed in circumstances that replicate the stress of the real world. So think doctors in doing triage and having difficult conversations about what procedures to follow, teachers dealing with kids with learning challenges and really having to confront pedagogical and behavior challenges at the same time, leaders leading through strategic change, or customer service people dealing with really difficult customers. Those things we do in an immersive virtual world that VR is very conducive to, but which by and large, in our case, can be done across many, many different platforms. I would say we are first and foremost a simulation provider, and we are, and I think maybe we are the only ones on this panel at least, that are somewhat platform agnostic on the way that we deliver this. I try to think about, in the same way this session has been the entire event has been very much about generative AI. I think about VR as a critical approach to developing skills that require, either for safety reasons or for technical reasons, things that cannot be replicated in the in 2D dimensional kind of environments. In our case, I think the critical differentiator of the work we do is the design of what a simulated conversation that has consequences for work. For example, the feedback a principal might give to a teacher that might discourage her from pursuing her career, the way in which you onboard a new team member and fail to acknowledge their background and differences and have that conversation with empathy, the way in which a doctor might interact with the family of somebody who just had a horrible outcome in an operating procedure and say something that produces litigation later on. Those things, I think it is very much the design of the way in which one gives a learner the opportunity to practice those things that becomes really critical and at the heart of the work that we hold very dear, much less whether it's done in a headset, on a phone, or on a laptop.
All right, we're going down the line. All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Bharanidharan Rajakumar. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called TRANSFR, Inc. I just have one question. So I know the panel discussion is, can AR, VR drive skills outcomes? What would everyone do if we said no? It cannot. Would you just walk out and leave? So I think one interesting thing, so we focus specifically on jobs that do not require a four-year degree, so specifically manufacturing and entry-level jobs into healthcare. They're all hands-on. And one of the things that kind of stuck out to us, to your question, is that for hands-on training that you might use an equipment for, or tools, machinery, all that stuff, it is extremely powerful and beneficial. People tend to retain information, a week after they've learned it, which is very different than if you're learning from a textbook or just watching a YouTube video. Where it's less helpful and less impactful, We have a learning intelligence team, got a few PhDs, and like all we do is study the impact of learning via virtual reality versus other mediums all day long. So where it's less impactful is when you're communicating theory-based knowledge, right? So a TED Talk, for example, you could watch it on YouTube or you could watch it in VR. You're not going to have like very much of a differentiated outcome using those mediums. However, if you're learning, for example, how to install an electric car battery for electric vehicles or solar panels, or what it means to kind of be a nurse technician or a nurse practitioner, like then it can have like very meaningful outcomes. And one of the things that I'm the most excited about is that these outcomes are relevant regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, and that to me is why this medium, like spatial computing, is very powerful. The last thing I would say is, had to throw out the buzzword, yeah. The last thing I would say is just in terms of motivation, like if you've ever, I mean, how many people here work with students directly? Just by show of hands, okay. As you might guess, when students learn in virtual reality or augmented reality, their engagement level just goes through the roof. And that to me is one of the biggest benefits. Motivation is one of these things that is not talked about a lot in education, but like you have to be motivated first if you're going to learn something and you're going to retain that knowledge. And this medium is very good at doing that. Case in point, anybody see the announcement by Meta on Monday about how they're going to go kind of really big into education? All of us have had the chance to work with them for years, and that is music to our ears. Right, so I think while there was a big hype cycle in the last decade and maybe the technology didn't live up to the hype, I think this decade would be a lot different.
So I may mention, every time we say spatial computing, everyone has to take a shot, I think. Maybe wrong crowd for that. Hi, I'm Justin Barad. I actually started out my career in video game development, and then a family member of mine had some health issues, and I started wondering maybe I can use technology to help people. And ultimately, I actually ended up becoming an orthopedic surgeon, funny enough, but started encountering a problem firsthand, which is how we train and assess healthcare professionals with things like procedures. And everywhere up from internship into my practice today, I see situations where people don't exactly know what to do, and frankly, sometimes even at top hospitals where people are Googling in the operating room or right before a procedure, or even right after a procedure, like, what did I do? And what's driving this really simply is a few different problems. One is there's just too much to learn. So if you think about it, you look at the pace of technology development, that's affecting us in healthcare, especially those that are delivering procedures. So the library of what we need to do every day is expanding at an exponential pace. To give you an example, one day I was called with 4 hours heads up notice that I needed to operate on a gorilla, which hopefully you all understand I was unprepared for, and it
gives
went
a
really
new
well.
meaning to the word gorilla in a room.
Yeah, Jabari was pushed off a cliff by his brother. He had a subtrochanteric femur fracture. I didn't know this is something I needed to know how to do. And it went great. It was a fun experience. I have lots of pictures if anyone wants to see. But, you never know what you're going to deal with as a healthcare professional. And we don't really have a way to learn things rapidly or know how to deal with these situations. Number two is we don't really have a way to objectively assess technical skill in healthcare. This is like probably pretty shocking for everybody to learn. But the only time I've really been objectively assessed for the ability to use my hands as a surgeon, I was asked to play board game operation, which I did. But I think we can do better. The third part of the problem is really the team variability that takes place. We've heard a lot about the Great Resignation, a lot of what Barani's doing. People are coming in and out at a more rapid pace, and we're not able to really get these people up to speed fast enough. And then finally, the modern surgery and procedures are really complicated. So all of these things like robotics and navigation and patient-specific, minimally invasive surgery, they're actually a lot harder to learn. So traditional surgery and open surgery, you might have to do 10 to 20 times before you could do it as a fully trained surgeon, before you could do it safely. Most modern procedures, as a fully trained surgeon, you have to do about 50 to 100 times. And when I say 50 to 100 times, that's on people. That's on you, me, or family. And so that's a situation I was being a part of every day. And so I got involved with virtual reality / spatial computing. Everyone, where are your shots? Really early on, because of my gaming background, I'm like, wow, what an incredible solution. You could train anytime, anywhere, in any procedure and get objective assessment. So founded the company Osso VR. It's the world's largest procedural training platform. Over 300 procedures that we simulate currently, and it's backed by 8 peer-reviewed studies, training around 4,000 to 5,000 healthcare professionals a month.
You had fun at med school.
So, my name's Jason Spyres. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Training All People, but that's a mouthful, so I call it TAP. To understand what my company does, you kind of need to understand who I am and what motivates me. So I'm going to make it real easy for you guys, because I'm about to tell you something you won't believe. So remember the name Jason, remember the word prison, and remember the word Stanford, and Google Jason Prison Stanford in any order, and my story will be all over the internet. So at the age of 19, I made this stupid decision to sell cannabis. I shouldn't have done it. It was a nonviolent offense, but it was still illegal, and I own up to that. But for reasons that President Barack Obama didn't even understand, I was given a 30-year prison sentence for it. After serving 15 years in prison, what I learned while I was in prison is there's also other policies in place that rendered me heinous, not violent, heinous, and exempted me from good time programs for getting involved in education or drug rehabilitation. They essentially said I was legally unrehabilitatable and unable to learn. When I got out, I was working as a dishwasher, became the first ever student admitted into Phi Theta Kappa as an incarcerated resident. Then I transferred to Stanford, where I studied artificial intelligence. Then I went to work in big tech. I'm now the CEO and co-founder of Tap3D. So all that is relevant because when's the good use cases of VR and when's the bad use cases? We need to quit making VR for everything. The name of my company is not Tap VR. It's not training all people who can afford a VR headset. It's how do you open people's aperture to success for themselves that they have yet to envision for themselves. And so I've had people ask me to make VR simulations for cutting hair. It's a horrible use case. Don't do it. I've had people say, ooh, what about using a tape measure? I'm like, it's $10 at Walmart. Go buy a tape measure. You don't need to put a 2-pound headset on somebody. I focus on when are we actually getting real advantages that's going to get someone dollar ready and get them on the job. I primarily work with industry and manufacturers. I'm starting to work with colleges. Last year, we trained 700 people, and over 500 of them are currently making money in the position that they were being trained to do. So one thing I will say is, can it drive an ROI and a skills outcome? The answer is resoundingly yes. What's wrong is so many people in this space are creating things that that's not true for. Don't focus on the technology. Focus on what you're trying to achieve with that technology. And that's what I'd say we need to be very careful in this space about.
So you all have, props to Jason.
Speaking of which, I gotta tell my bad joke. So I wanted to make this panel interesting for everybody. So I proposed that we did a VR death match with the headset of our choice, customized to hurt each other, right? Would that have gotten everybody's attention? Would it have been a widely talked about panel? That goes back to making VR to use a tape measure. Might be fun, it serves no useful value. And so I was glad that my panel was like, yeah, it'd be fun, but maybe Jason quit being crazy.
Okay, so let's dig into that, Jason. So everyone here has, reps going to market and growth, right? So with VR as your medium of training delivery, what skepticism or barriers to adoption have each of you faced in your growth journey?
Yeah, I can start with that one. So the company started in October 5th of 2017. And I can tell you in the beginning, because we focus mostly on individuals that do not have a job, we call them undiscovered talent. They are effectively an underinvested population. The first thing that investors said was, like, how are you going to make any money at this? Like, your end user makes no money. And then the second thing that investors said is, wait a minute, you want to work with the government? Like, the government's your customer? So we work with high schools, 2-year colleges, unemployment offices, and nonprofits. We were effectively like nuclear waste. Like, no one would talk to us. But what we ended up figuring out is that there are a lot of misconception about the target population that we work with. For example, one is they don't want to work. And what we ended up figuring out is that virtual reality is a really great medium, as Jason said, to enable people to kind of envision a different future for themselves. And so when you can do that, then they become motivated, then they acquire the skills and the jobs that we place people in, they earn, $50,000 to $100,000 a year with an employer that will, give them benefits such as healthcare, 401k. Like our target population, a lot of them don't even know that they could get a 401k. So that's pretty powerful. But once we got that, machine going, the good news is that we live in a capitalist society. And so when something starts working and you can show that you have a valid business model, investors show up by the truckloads. And so we've then used that investment. So we have about 277 employees. We've deployed in about 1,200 locations across the country. We had about 50,000 users use the service last quarter, Q1 of this year, which is more than the number of people we had in all of 2022. So what is exciting to see is that, the investor community does not view us as nuclear waste anymore. Now they're very actively interested in, helping us grow the business so that we can get everybody who wants to work into a job that pays well.
So just to double click on that for a second, what about customer skepticism though? Like that's investors. Like how did you get over those barriers with customers?
Look, I think I am pleasantly surprised at how many people are in this room. Right? It's Wednesday. I thought it was going to be 10 people. I thought we were going to be listening to Jason's bad jokes the whole time.
I was worried the audience would be smaller than the people on the stage.
Exactly. And so what I would say to answer your question is that there are people who get it, and they really get it. And the people who get it are folks who are working, for example, with our target population. You might ask Justin this question. He'll give you a different response because he works with, a lot of doctors, and they got a lot of opinions about everything. And so what I would say is that when we started working with educators, it was so obvious. They were just like, well, duh. I want to engage my students. Obviously I want them to do well. Clearly I want them to see themselves in a better future. So it was not at all hard to convince that for our end user. You might have a different story.
I got to respond to the opinions comment. They say 2 surgeons, 3 opinions. So yeah, I think it's, I'm sure we could talk all day in multiple panels about the challenges that we faced in this field, and the hype cycles have been brutal. But I'll say that this has opened up a lot of just. I would say the 2 things that stick out to me is one is that excitement is like a double-edged sword, and I'm seeing it happen in AI too, and maybe it'll be less of an issue, but dreaming of what's possible can be really disappointing for people when they realize what is actually possible, or how much it costs to do those things that they're dreaming of or seeing and putting the work in. And there's kind of this disillusionment that takes place of I was told I could do this, this, and this, and in my head I had everybody comes to us envisioning a haptic glove that's remotely controlling a surgical robot on another planet. And I'm like, what YouTube videos have you been watching? Every day somebody's asking about that. So there's the expectations versus what the technology can do, which is amazing, is just a thing that has required a lot of education. I think another thing is around ROI and the value of training. One is that this training and education, especially in healthcare, you really have to have today a clear ROI. You can't just be doing something because it's cool. But I think what's challenging and interesting is that we get a lot of questions on does this work? Do you have proof that this works, right? Can this drive higher skills outcomes? And yes, we have 8 peer-reviewed studies. One study showed a 230% improvement in surgical performance that was done at UCLA independently. Another study done at University of Illinois Chicago showed that with traditional training, 25% of a group of learners could complete a procedure without needing supervision. And that lines up with graduating residents today. About 31% can operate without needing supervision, that's after 14 years of education, by the way. Really 15 if you're doing a fellowship. With Osso VR for training and assessment, that went up to 78%. It was published in a journal called Core. So yes, the data is there. And then also, how does this drive our business if we're a healthcare institution, or how does this drive our business if we work with a lot with medical device and pharma companies? But so we're getting all these questions, and then these companies, especially the companies we work with that have these hands-on cadaver labs that are extremely expensive. They're done all over the world. They're spending tens, hundreds of millions of dollars on training and education. I say, well, if you don't mind me asking, what data do you have that what you do today works? What's the ROI of your training today? And there's never an answer. And I think what what is happening is that this is a new form of training, so there are a lot of questions about it, but we've never really understood how do we assess the value of training? How do we assess the value of education? What is the ROE, the return on education, as we like to say? And no one's ever really had to face that question before because we've never been in a situation like this where we actually could do it differently. It doesn't have to be hands-on. And people are actually just paying attention now and being like, hey, wait, like, why are we doing this? Because a lot of the training that we do, while it's amazing and it's really cool, and obviously training in hands-on is great, basic adult learning shows you forget 90% of what you learn within a week. It's 50% within 24 hours. So hands-on training does not work very well unless it's paired with something that allows you to sort of repeat that training over and over and to be objectively assessed. And again, in the hands-on training right now, once again, you're doing it, but no one is actually checking that you're learning what you need to know, and so there's no assessment. So a lot of the challenges are partially around spatial computing, but it's also questions that we've just never asked before because we've never had to, because this is just the way we've done it for hundreds of years, and we've never had an opportunity like this before.
So I want to kind of comment on that. So first off, he's much taller than me, so applaud me on my confidence for speaking back on him. I worked with industry, right? I worked with manufacturers who actually care, and we got to do case studies, and we got to have two separate groups. One do our training, one not. We do pre and post assessments, and with Northrop Grumman, we showed a 45% skill improvement over a 6-hour training. At other customers, when it took 6 weeks to certify someone to do a procedure on their own, our group was able to get the certification in 3 weeks. And so while it's not backed by like an academic university case study, a manufacturer can have a fab manager on the floor saying Bob, Tom, and Sally was able to do it certified quicker, and I actually trust to let them do it without me standing over their shoulder now. And Jerry, Tom, and Ben over here didn't do that training, and I'm still finding 10% errors when they're going through. So you can say that's anecdotal because it's not widely, a nationwide study. But I do think there is ways to assess the outcome of it. I think the thing is a lot of people create a training in mind with, ooh, will it work, rather than starting with, how am I going to prove that this training is effective once I have it created? You need to start with what's the framework, how are you going to measure success, what are the learning objectives, how do you demonstrate those learning objectives have been met? Not, ooh, I think I can make something that people will like. When people say something's immersive and you got their attention, there's plenty of shows on Netflix that get my attention. I don't remember the story of half of them. Being immersive and having someone's attention is not the same as learning. And that's one of the things that I always try to argue for.
I actually want to say, how many of you in here are from higher ed? And just out of curiosity, education and nursing, or mostly education? University in the higher ed field, K-12. So I asked because we actually began, we were co-created with universities in a university, and there's this, it's funny that there is this sort of subtext in a lot of ed tech that, universities are actually slow to innovate, slow to experiment. I actually think, but were it not for university experimentation, we wouldn't be here today. We had a group of university faculty who were really interested in reinventing methods courses around working with kids with special needs. And the one thing they wanted to make sure happened was that teacher candidates didn't learn the practice in front of real kids. So how were they going to solve that problem? There was only so much theory and text that was going to get them there. Even video-based examples, which was the state of the art of business I used to be in many years ago, don't actually give you the circumstances where you practice a pedagogical routine, perfect how it's delivered, assess the impact of it. And so we have 80 schools of education that have been using us now for almost 10 years, and many of them were part of the incubation of this at a university. Those folks not only use it in their methods courses, but they publish research on its efficacy, and so we have learned along the way two things. One, how do you design simulations to actually get the learning outcomes that Jason's talking about? I totally agree, and I do think learning design in this medium is different than learning design in other mediums, obviously is. I think we'd all stipulate that this is the most most engaging medium that exists out there. There is nothing else you can do when you are involved in a dynamic, interactive simulation right now. So, and the other thing that we've learned over time is that you get powerful learning in short doses as well. If you think about time as the most precious commodity a lot of our learners have, you're going to get impact over time. So in our case, we've also done like 5 randomized controlled trials initially funded by people like Gates and Schusterman that were super interested in the evolution of the field. Then as we moved into commercial, we serve now most of our revenue comes from large enterprise, professional services, fintech. We do a lot in healthcare these days, and big tech, where issues like leadership are very much at play. And there, it's really interesting to me also that as I spent 15 years in K-12, with this sort of envy of corporate learning, as though this was the holy grail, if we could only imitate what the best of enterprise is doing. And I actually think it's unfair. I think that same journey, there was a panel here yesterday for a number of the CLOs who lead some of the top, Fortune 500 companies, and they're still figuring out some of the basic things that you all have been wrestling out in higher ed for a very long time. And we're learning alongside them. So they went down a path of commoditizing learning, micro-learning, online, ubiquitous, but totally disengaging, not tied to performance outcomes. And they're sort of rethinking immersive simulation as a way to get engagement and get data on where people really have strengths and weaknesses. And I just want to underscore, I think, one thing that all of us have learned: this platform, these platforms, and this approach to learning produces a whole new kind of data of what people are able to do under workplace stresses. Because it's one thing to isolate a learner, give them access to something, and give them some assessment of it, decontextualized from the circumstances where they would have to do the work or do the task. But the great thing about simulation and simulation in these kinds of platforms is that you see how people are able to perform under the stressful circumstances under which they're going to have to do the task. Whether it is isolating a child that has specific needs that need attention, or navigating a complex decision with a team under pressure, or dealing with a really difficult customer in circumstances where you're going to say something that hurts your brand or hurts your job security, to be perfectly honest with you. And that's something that I think these technologies do that nothing else has been able to do. And I think our customers are actually teaching us the way to do it well and build it in the context. And that's true in higher ed. And in my experience, it's increasingly true in the enterprise as well.
Yeah, I just want to double up on that because, I think what you just described is like 1,000 times more critical in what we do in healthcare, because our lives are dependent on it. And I don't know if referencing aviation right now with all the Boeing stuff is good, but pilots, they are assessed in simulators and reassessed every 6 months to make sure it's safe for them to fly. Maybe the plane should be reassessed too, but that's all getting better. But
if only there were people creating industrial maintenance training to help people get better with that.
We're the solution to all of your problems. But in healthcare, the reason why I did this, and this has been an amazing journey, but incredibly hard, and all of my surgeon colleagues still think that I've lost my mind to go down this road and walk away from full-time surgery trying to solve this problem. But the reason why I stood up and felt like someone had to do something is that it's not just surgeons. You have nurses, mid-levels, techs. They're all doing stuff to us, physical things to us. And no one is checking to make sure that they're able to do those things or that they're continuing to be able to do those things. So I'll highlight 2 examples for you guys. And I want to reassure you all, most healthcare is safe. Surgeons are safe and good. But these things do happen. We're all aware of it, right? We're not looking our pilots up on Yelp, but you guys are probably looking me up right now. So here's the thing. So I'll just use surgeons as an example because I understand that the best. But when I am entering residency, when I am getting a job as a surgeon, people are looking at my test scores. People are looking at feedback on how I am to work with. But no one is objectively looking at my ability to physically and technically do this job. And that is the story behind Dr. Death Season 1. I'm not affiliated with that podcast, but this is an area where we could have caught that. And you talk to any surgeon, and 100% they've seen this. There are just some people that are just missing the connection between the brain and the hands, and that they're unable, they won't be able to figure it out. But once they're in, and they will be operating on you and me, and that's just the way it is. And then as we near the tail end of our career, this is a very controversial area as well, but you just start to get psychomotor decline as you age, and some people earlier than others. You start to develop a tremor, and it happens to all of us. This is not like avoidable. And so at some point, it is no longer safe to operate. But there is no checkpoint to check if you are at that point or not. And I have personally been involved in cases where people were harmed as a result of this, and everyone's like, knows that it's a problem, but there's no system in place to objectively and fairly kind of institute this. And the only thing I've seen is a hard age cutoff at certain institutions, which I don't think is necessarily fair either. So these are just two areas where, people's lives are at risk, and this is the first technology I've seen that can really fairly assess these things to just make sure that in the extremes that the people that coming into the system are good enough to be able to do the job, which I think is reasonable, and then also that we're phasing people out once they're at the point where they can no longer do it, just like aviation.
So we don't have much time left. I actually want to talk about the hardware for a minute. Do you all have any thoughts on the actual headsets?
We all love Meta, right? We all love Meta.
Well, but Apple Vision Pro launched not too long ago at an extremely high price point. And where do we see this going 5, 10 years from now? Are we all walking around with headsets on?
I've seen that, and it's disturbing.
I'm sure Mr. Cook would say yes, but I'd love to hear your points of view on this.
Look, I think, so we can talk about hardware, but we should talk about technology more broadly. I think what is so fascinating is how people focus on the technology a lot. The reality is the technology becomes commoditized like really fast. I mean, it is so surprising. Like, first of all, a lot of the hardware comes from like 2 cities in China. And sometimes some of these hardwares come from the exact same manufacturing line. So when you're talking about like market development, like the hardware that works in your market is going to depend on the cost. So for example, the Apple Vision Pro, beautiful Apple, not going to be a great fit for every single market, right? Might not be a great fit for the education market. But the other technology that is really fascinating that will make this technology, that will make AR, VR, XR, spatial computing even more useful is AI. So you're right, there is a hype cycle around AI just as there was with XR, but the reality is like there's a lot of learning science that AI is actually based off of, like how people learn, how machines learn are kind of predicated on how people learn. And so I think one of the most interesting things that you'll see over the next decade is not just that people talk about immersion, but people will talk about the interactivity, right? And all the interactivity is where you affect like cognition, human cognition, and that's where the learning outcomes are driven. So I think hardware prices will keep coming down. They'll continue to be commoditized. And what really matters is the use case, to your point about ROI, is the use case. So whether it's helping people learn soft skills or training teachers in the classroom without having them, operate on kids or, teaching kids, putting them in the classroom when they're inexperienced. These use cases, gorillas. These use cases are where you can really help build like a profitable, sustainable business and grow your impact.
What I would say is to the hardware is, as we go over time, I think there's 2 things that made the iPhone take off that I don't think that the VR community, or to use the buzzword, whatever, spatial computing doesn't have. One is you already needed to have a phone, and most people already listened to music, right? The difference is with VR is I think the primary use case right now is going to be in the training space and the education space and maybe the video gaming space, which is a clear fit, right? But think of training as like a textbook. Do you walk around with your textbook all day long when you're not at school? No, you have your textbook out when you're ready to use your textbook. So I think Meta's done great things at getting a proliferation of hardware so people are more aware of how to use it and more familiar with it. I think Apple's doing great trying to make it more familiar to the wide range public. We finally got a manufacturer with stores all across the nation where you can go in and get a free demo and learn how to use a headset, and that's amazing. But over time, I don't think its usage will ever exceed its use cases. And so while they're all great manufacturers, I don't think we're going to have that iPhone moment where everybody's using it, because the iPhone was accumulation of things we were already done packaged into a new one-on product.
I was on a conversation with a group yesterday around, I want to use AI as the, back to your question about hardware. Because I do think AI, especially at this event, has become an end unto itself. And like the headset, it is just a tool. We're the vendors, you're the buyers. Your job is to tell us what's the problem you need to solve. And our job is to come up with the configuration of tools that solve your problem. And our approach to that is, yes, there are some unique things that in a headset are hard to do on a phone, but a phone can do a lot, so can an iPad, and so can a laptop, and those are all really good tools. You shouldn't have to buy a tool to get the solution that you actually need in the end of the day. And so I think there are opportunities to drive really data-driven, engaging, outcomes-based learning across the board with the tools that are in the market right now. And what I think is behind is the design of how to integrate these things into sort of consistent, long learning journeys for your learners, so that content that is ubiquitous and increasingly free is integrated with experiences that bring that to life, with assessments that measure the things that you actually care about and show the behavior changes that you want to see in the learners that you are after. And our job is to help you put those things together in powerful outcomes. So often, I feel like people are asking us to build to the thing they bought yesterday. And that is a really bad model for change to come about. And I think all these tools are getting better. There's unquestionable, the phone is getting better. I mean, so it is a really incredibly powerful device. And so I just think that if the one thing, as those of us who build in VR should say to all of you, it shouldn't be about the tool, the hardware itself. It should be about the learning outcome.
Yeah, I think, on two sides of the question. So generative AI, I think it is very interesting for us. I think one of the biggest challenges in this space when it comes to like training and simulation is the development of the simulation content. And that can be very time consuming and expensive depending on how you're doing it, how complex it is. And so generative AI holds a lot of promise to addressing some of these problems and accelerating some of that development, which I think has been part of the barrier to entry in this space. And when it comes to headsets, Vision, they're both amazing headsets, and one's much more affordable. And I think all of the hardware that is out there now is more than sufficient to do what needs to be done. That's what the data shows. This is like what we have. There's no need to wait for tomorrow. What we have today works. There's just like, you don't get data this good. But what does need improvement is not really the hardware. It's more like the software that drives it and the friction and change management. And so, and a lot of it is the focus that these have been designed as general purpose devices. And I think a lot of us as vendors have been saying the same thing, that we need to focus on specific spaces, and training is a unique space where, when people pull out their textbook, they want to just be able to open it and go. And there's still a lot of friction with that process that exists outside of us that would be very helpful to address. And it has nothing to do with hardware. It's really more of a software problem. Yeah. And then I think also that these simulations are incredible, and people tend, when they're making these purchasing decisions, they try the simulations, they're like, oh great, I want that. But what they're not seeing is that, when you're even just like when we turn on your phone and you're like doing a factory reset, installing something, like we're all used to how to do that. We understand that design language, that interface, and using spatial computing, 3D computing, it's different, and people aren't used to it. And so it's an adjustment when they get these headsets and they have to set them up, or they have to use it, or they have to troubleshoot it. It's a whole new skill set that people aren't used to. And so that takes some time, and also could be, once again, smoother. So I think the more we can get the friction of getting into these experiences down, the more it'll be adopted. And I don't think that's a hardware issue at all. And generative AI, I think, is very exciting for all of us.
The perfect example of that is when I got out of prison, people asked me what was the scariest thing I encountered after 15 years. It was this. Somebody handed me this, and I couldn't even turn it on. And so when you speak to the software, I think the hardware works great, but when I hand someone a headset that's never seen it, just learning how to turn it on and put it on so that your eyes see through it, I think that's the thing that's actually holding back the major VR adoption.
So we are at time. Thank you all so much for an amazing
Thank you for
panel.
coming.